What's up, everybody? Today on the Yours Truly podcast, I have Bryce Carlile in the virtual studio. I bumped into Bryce in the Hive Mind, otherwise known as the live chat on the YouTube premiere of my conversation with Karen Wong from the Meaning Code. I don't quite remember what he said to me in the chat, but I think it was something along the lines of, "I'd love to talk to you sometime, Christian." Maybe Bryce can recall. But regardless, I pointed him towards my email and we set up a time to practice some conversation craft. I don't have much background on Bryce, but the two videos posted on his YouTube channel. One of them is him talking about his recent experience seeing Jordan Peterson on his tour in Atlanta. I'm excited to see where we might converge and even diverge in our connections today, because connection and relationship is what will ultimately emerge regardless. So, without further delay, I give you Bryce Carlile 5749. Hi. This is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. And here we are.
Good morning.
Amen. So, yeah, Bryce, I didn't have a whole lot, and even that Jordan Peterson video, I don't know if the sound's working on it, because I couldn't.
Oh, right, on my channel?
Yeah.
Yeah, I messed up. I'm experimenting on starting a channel, and I've got a lot to learn. So I used my cell phone microphone, and something got messed up. But I wanted to, I was trying to process some of my immediate thoughts after watching Jordan Peterson here in Austin. So
Austin.
yeah.
I said Atlanta. Okay, cool. I guess I got that. So like AAX, or I guess
ATX is, that's the abbreviation
Austin,
we use
Texas.
for
Gotcha.
Austin.
I got that. Well, cool, man. Yeah, you were. I don't remember exactly what you said. Something along the lines of maybe I'd love to talk, but either way, you reached out, and I'm just continuing to try to follow that. I'm not to any place where like I have time right now for extenuating circumstances, and I'm not at a place where I'm being flooded with things. So I'm open to a lot of conversation if the conversation makes sense,
Yeah.
So, I mean, and so on that, I guess from your perspective, like, how did we get to this conversation?
Yeah. So going back several years ago, I was kind of in a transition myself. I had left the place of where I was working as a teacher for about 10 years here in Austin, and starting a new school. It's called Waterloo School. It's a Christian high school, and we took a year to sort of research our model and figure out exactly which direction we were going to go as we were starting the school. This is like the summer of 1819-ish. No, the summer of, the academic year of 1819 was the year we took off to research. I had found Paul because I was watching Jordan Peterson, Paul Vanderklay, and had a couple of conversations with Paul. And I've just been honestly watching his channel pretty regularly since it started. And so, as I'm on my podcast, I noticed your name started to pop up. I had sort of been lurking, but having, periodic conversations with Paul. And, just as the conversations go, you start to become more familiar with the language, and just honestly listening in on all these conversations. I think there's a natural impulse that you want to just jump in and participate. And so when I saw you and Luke and others start to kind of launch channels, I thought, I think this is a good time to just come out of the shadows a little bit more and participate. I had befriended Julian, who's up in Canada. He was an early Randos United guy. And so we've had a ton of kind of offline conversations. So more participating in that way. But I thought, I'll reach out to Christian. I love just the way you kind of boldly jumped in there and took the bull by the horns and started reaching out to all these people. Because, it's like estuary is this idea, and it's this thing that we need to be practicing. And, can you do it online? But it's almost like, it needs to be in person, but it also can be practiced online. Why not?
Yeah, I think it's interesting what some of this is, um, and like you said, that estuary needs to be happening. I invited two guys to come over tonight because I was talking to my wife, and I'm doing all this stuff, talking to people, addictive personality, or am I doing too much and all this kind of stuff. And she had gone out with some friends to like get some drinks. One of her friends was like having a hard time, and they were gonna hang out. And that's something that I was like, man, I wish somebody would call me to go get drinks, like,
Yeah.
like, and she's like, well, you can invite people. And I was like, oh yeah. So,
Yeah.
there are like levels to this thing, like, finding that where you're at, even feeling like maybe you had to reach out to a guy in Canada that you met through this space just to have this conversation, and what I've found by doing this, and even the guys that are coming over, I've known one of them for 10 years, or more. And the other guy, a little less, but, these are guys in my town, and various ways of relating to them. And some of them, they pay attention to some of the stuff I've started doing. And that allows, like, okay, so let's start talking here. And
Mm.
so, as you mentioned, possibly trying to do a little bit more online, like even the idea of just talking about this experience with Jordan Peterson, it's like, going to, because, that can be a little bit awkward to bring up with some people for his,
Mm.
polarization or whatnot. I don't know, especially
Yep.
here in Atlanta, that's kind of who knows. But I'm just thinking, this conversation, having conversation, like you're pointing at estuary. Yeah, it is something that, well, we used to have a lot more superficial conversations about, when Paul talked about the monoculture.
Yeah.
And now that, when that's gone away, we're like, I don't even, and when politics got so intense, I was like, what do you even talk about?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I noticed that too. I noticed the tone of the way people are talking, even on YouTube, shifted pretty sharply in the year around 2013, 2014. I would watch it for various reasons. I was a school teacher, and I would always watch, looking for resources to help my students do their thesis research and that type of thing. And so I'd always, I'd find the names of published authors that I like to read, and I just noticed that there was a switch towards a sharpness, the hot take, the signal and reactionary logic that doesn't have much patience for nuance, for a patient dialogue, for give and take, opponent processing, that type of thing. And then that just got hypercharged after COVID. It's like the tone became, it's almost like Twitter, just the X factor, the Twitterization of our discourse. And I really worry about this. My background is in is teaching. Most of my professional life has been teaching in classical Christian schools, and their whole reason for existing is to try to retrieve some of the dialogue and the rhetoric skills that used to be kind of the backbone of Christian education, medieval education, Renaissance education. So grammar, logic, rhetoric. And I feel really spoiled, to have been able to teach in that kind of a context where you're trying to retrieve these treasures. These are things that I studied in seminary, and I'm like, gosh, this so did not factor into my own education. And so you kind of like a kid in the candy store. But then you look around, and just referring to what I'm talking about, like, we really need these tools because we're not having good conversations. We don't listen well. And so anyway, I've just had with that as my background, and with the continuing polarization, as you mentioned, just an appreciation for what you and Paul and others have been doing to try to just lean into it's a weird thing to have conversations online, but hey, let's practice together. let's take the risk and start an estuary. Let's practice together online. What is it to listen better? So I wanted to know, what do you do full time? Like, you're doing this, I'm assuming, on the side. What do you do full time?
I am a registered nurse.
Oh, cool.
I've been in like cardiovascular ICUs for almost 5 years. Yeah, I don't know how much of my story you've been able to catch or where you've jumped into the conversation I've started having, but I used to be in ministry full time.
Yeah, I did catch that.
Okay. So, and then, yeah, so I've been doing that right now. I've been a travel nurse since the tail end of COVID.
Okay.
So I've been at 2 different hospitals, one for a year and a half, one for like 9 months. And right now I've got another contract I'll be starting in like 2 weeks, but I've had some time off in between trying to get those worked out. So I was like, well, I'll just start seeing if people want to have more conversations.
Yeah.
So that's why it's been I've been churning on this a little bit, but that's, yeah, in between that. And, but yeah, that's what I do. So, what have you done a rando on Paul? Did you do a rando on Paul or just had like, email or something with him, or what have you
Yeah,
done?
I've had 3 or 4. One of them didn't get published.
Okay.
One of them only got published in the members.
Okay.
That was the most recent one.
So you have unpacked your story, I guess, then on there,
Yeah.
which I haven't seen.
Yeah.
So if you want to give me the shortened version of kind of your background and story, that would probably be helpful.
Yeah.
Me and everyone else.
So the condensed version, and I actually could kind of summarize what I shared with Paul in my recent one. So I've been a pastor of youth and family here at First Baptist Church in Dripping Springs for about a year full time. And I still have a foot in the door in helping with the board and helping to run the school that we started. My process in discerning a call into ministry was really largely helped by Paul, by listening to his many stories and just watching him. So it's interesting how, if you were getting mentored along in discerning a call, you would hang out with somebody locally and in person. And I did do that as well. Our local pastor here, Pastor Clay. But over the years, just watching Paul talk about his experience just gave me a different way of observing and sort of in a sense being mentored at a distance. And we'd had these conversations, so I felt like, well, I kind of know him. I don't know him well, but I'm getting to know his heart. I'm getting to know his love for his people, and just watching. And over the years, as that kind of unfolded, I'm like, I've been to seminary. I've worked in Christian schools. I keep having this sense of calling that I want to help people know God's love for them in Christ, and wherever they are. What is that? And so this has kind of been an interesting and in many ways a difficult thing to do. I'm 48, so this is a new direction in my life as far as profession. I have 5 kids, and they're all boys. My oldest is a freshman in high school, and then my youngest is a first grader. So they're all packed in. And my wife and I, just raising 5 kids, the last 10 years has just been a whirlwind with that. And so discerning a call in those circumstances it's been, and then add on top of that, COVID, starting a new school. It just sort of has been a whirlwind. But this little corner, the conversations have been, for me, as I drive, I put on the podcast and I listen, and it's just been a thing to it's been a touchstone, been a reference point. And I think what I would share, from my background of why it's meaningful to me. I grew up in the church. I grew up in a Presbyterian mainline church that was evangelical in its kind of grounding in Wichita, Kansas. We had an awesome youth program, awesome youth leader, and we had wonderful friends. It was a big group. So, growing up in Kansas in the 80s and the 90s, I feel like in some ways I was lucky to have access to mentors and voices in that church culture that they were grounded in the Bible and they were deep theological, but they were also kind of with it because they were they weren't trying to polarize, and they were the culture of our church was kids could smoke cigarettes on retreats, but then we would be talking about Gospel of John any chance we could. It's kind of that
Early hipster, like embracing grunge or something
oh,
like.
absolutely. Yeah, the stuff that we would play on the church sound system at retreats was stuff that I look back on and I'm just like, we did what? It's a little bit of the Wild West in youth ministry, but it was so good in so many ways. So the name of the group was Real Life. And the whole theme of it was relationships are your greatest treasure.
Wow.
If our youth minister had a default that he would fall back on, it was Gospel of John, Letters of John. He had a T-shirt made that said, "You have two things to do today: love God and love your neighbor." And there was, it was Bible Belt, yes, it was evangelical, kind of middle of America, but it also had that relaxed kind of, we're not in this mega culture war feeling. And some of that was just the 80s and 90s. But I look back on that and I see so much groundwork laid. So then when I got into college, I joined the Navigators, went to an evangelical Presbyterian church, the EPC, really fell in love with Reformed theology. And then I did an internship with the Navigators. That's where I met my wife. She was in the Navigators, which is, campus ministry, community, military campus ministry. She was at Duke, and kind of in the middle to late 90s, I was at Kansas, and we met in an internship and got married a year later after spending less than a month in the same zip code. So,
it can work.
It was great. Yeah, it's great context we obviously spent some time in our first year of marriage actually getting to know each other and learning how to love and trust one another and trust that this was a good thing. And then we just had some wonderful years. I went to seminary at Princeton Seminary, and she started her career in environmental geology. And then we had wonderful friends in a small group at a little PCA church up in Princeton. And those were really rich years for us. We loved going into the city, and just having culture. We had been in rural Ohio for a year before that, and didn't have a lot of access to the city, and we loved that kind of thing. And so that was 9/11 happened my freshman year. It was a crazy time to be up there. Tim Keller was the big shot in the evangelical world.
Well, 9/11 was when their church doubled in size. Overnight.
Yeah, exactly. They had been sort of steadily growing, and it was an interesting time to be in seminary. It was an interesting time to be a part of, the PCA there and watching that. I tried to turn my internship at the church there into an opportunity to see if I was actually getting a calling to ministry. And it didn't work out. And then it didn't work out like 3 or 4 other times until just this last year. So I've got a really interesting kind of long delay story as far as, and I think some of that, Christian, is honestly, I wrestled coming from that background of just being saturated in church culture and growing up, baptized and raised in the Presbyterian context in a really serious, my dad was kind of an armchair theologian. And I think at seminary and in college campus ministry context, I really wanted to figure out what did it mean to bring the gospel outside of the church walls and outside of the institution and encounter people who are actually seeking and hungry. And so missional theology was kind of a big thing. Like, what does it look like to reach out? And I think that's where, Tim Keller and his church planting emphasis was a was a really big deal there. So that may have played a part in that kind of that delay. But anyway, that's after I graduated from seminary. That's when I found the classical Christian school method, method and way of doing education. And I started at Trinity Academy in Raleigh and taught Spanish and humanities there, and then left that, did home building for a couple of years, just in time for the 2008 crisis, financial crisis. My wife and I kind of went through a really hard patch at that time in our marriage. And this was got some counseling, and thank God we were able to work through some things with amazing support from friends. And I mean, that's a whole separate conversation, just how God kind of intervened and through relationships. And anyway, we had our first child not long after that. So it was 2009 summer, and I had just lost my job, and because of the downturn in the economy. And so worked several odd jobs, and then found an open door here in Austin, Texas at Regent School of Austin. And so that's what brought us to Texas. We had 4 more kids here, and it's been a wild ride.
Yeah, man, there's a lot there. Interesting. Tim Keller, the pastor that I worked with for 5 years, was still with here locally for another 5, total 10 years or close to 10 years here. He was he did his MDiv at Yale and was in that milieu at the same time. Got ordained PCA, and Keller was a huge influence, and he's about your age too. So y'all were kind of swimming, close over there in those Ivy League ministry program, divinity programs, and that really that influenced me by proxy of then us working very closely together. And then you're talking about, obviously relationship in your marriage, and it sounds like we had our first kid in December of 2009. And we've got 3, 14 down to 7. What else did you say you had going on? The calling, classical. Oh yeah, I wanted to see. Have you ever tried to connect with Cale Zeldin? Have you?
We're supposed to. Yeah, we're supposed to connect because I know he works in it's either
Catholic,
classical.
It's a Catholic prep school, high school.
Yeah, that has a classical emphasis. Yeah.
Yeah, in Rhode Island, he does great literature, or great works literature. And then what else was going on there? I wanted to bounce back. I think there was one. Well, you kind of you hit on, obviously. This interesting idea. Have you ever seen Sam Tiedeman's Transfigured podcast? Like, he made a comment on a recent Paul Vanderklay, video, and he talked about, I think it was about the Orthodox Church, but he was talking about, he used the phrase, all these online converts. When you were talking about basically like an online call, like a YouTube call to ministry under the mentorship of Paul Vanderklay, like, you can't. This is all brand new,
right?
And it's taking place over 5 to 7 years, and there's interestingly odd relationship through this digital medium, and then these things actually come to, hey, I've got this guy's phone number, and we talk a lot, and I've had 3 conversations with Paul, and now we're that's all wild, and I'm playing catch up, because I wasn't even a lurker. I was just a watcher. I wasn't lurking in the community. I just was watching these people, like watching the, Peterson and Peugeot and Paul, and so I didn't even know. The last 4 months have been catch up on all of this.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Did you say you were at First Baptist? That
Yes.
okay, so
Yeah.
that's obviously a theological piece that's in there. That's kind of interesting. Of course, you're in Atlanta, so Atlanta's a little bit more.
No,
Yeah,
we're in Austin,
okay, I
Texas.
keep saying
Yeah,
that. You're in
that's
Austin.
okay.
Austin still, it's yeah.
Yeah.
So I would be interested on how you made that, how and why you made that theological turn, or how that worked out for you, and then yeah. So YouTube converts and calls to ministry and churches,
Yeah.
and then you talked about this little corner. I'd be interested in like how you see um just all the diversity, yet there's like a unity. Luke talks about unity and diversity, and um how that's kind of playing out, and it's really cool to be talking now to a Baptist, an official Baptist, about these things. So yeah, hit it
Yeah,
up.
that I don't know how much I am comfortable with the it's actually no, I want to comment on that because I think it's absolutely relevant to the TLC and the almost by design ecumenical nature of the conversation, in that we're not as a Protestant, we're almost by definition not able to and not committed to. Well, I guess if you're a fundamentalist, you could, but
Uh,
say my way or the highway.
yeah.
So, no, I have way too much modern theological influence
Mm.
in my formation, in my study. The way theology was presented and the way we studied it in seminary. I had Orthodox professors, I had Roman Catholic professors, I had Lutheran professors, I had
Mhm.
atheist professors, atheist
Yep.
Episcopalians, University of Chicago types who were just, School of Religions. And then I had some of my favorite professors. One of them in particular had Eastern Orthodox roots, grew up in Kentucky, joined a Presbyterian youth group, and became a Presbyterian ordained minister, but and then an Episcopal priest. So the overlap of modern, mainline, traditional, magisterial, reformed, Lutheran, Calvinist, Orthodox, Catholic. It was all just part of the conversation, and there was a real sense that we could all learn from each other, and that we could, that I loved that liberal mainline ethos, and I loved the way that people who were serious about, even if they had conservative and Orthodox, even Orthodox Presbyterian, the folks who split off from Princeton to go start Westminster were welcomed in the PhD program. And
Mm.
I think coming from middle America, from Kansas, in the time that I did, I really enjoyed that spirit of dialogue and that spirit of we're all trying to figure this out together. Of course, at Princeton, the theology of Karl Barth is just like lurking in the background over everything. And
Neoliberalism.
yeah, neo-orthodoxy.
Yeah, that's right. Neo-Orthodox, yeah.
That's the term. Yeah, which is interesting. Do you call it neoliberal or neo-orthodox? Because you could actually make a case that he's either or both.
Yeah, I can't remember. All my stuff is just very surface level, and it all came from conversations with that pastor I worked with. He
Well, I
he
mean,
introduced me to all that.
it was the professors there were people who'd studied at Yale in the middle 20th century under H.R. Niebuhr and alongside Jaroslav Pelikan and others. It was sort of a post-liberal ethos, like the conversation. The conversation was, hey, we've been through modern theology, we've been through the Enlightenment. There's no going back and pretending that this didn't happen, but we're also not locked up. Our gears aren't locked up because of modern hierarchical so there's a whole emphasis on narrative theology and reading the text theologically, And I found that refreshing. I found that inspiring to have an ethos there that was open to whatever counted for developed and consensus modern science, evolution, an old cosmos, the idea that there were multiple sources and redacted sources for the composition of the Bible. It made sense to me. It just made absolute sense that the Bible. And so you could, when Jordan Peterson comes along and it sort of is doing his read of the Bible in the wake of that and seeking psychological resonance, I kind of found that inspiring and parallel to the way we were trying to do that theologically. Brevard Childs and canon criticism was kind of the name of the game. So it was a post, I guess you could say postmodern in the chronological sense approach to these things. So anyway, I went off on that to sort of paint the picture of when I was doing my theological study. There were two themes that stood out to me. One was this ecumenical and friendly to modern develops ethos, kind of the dialogue there. But also there was a real church-centered ministry and outreach, missional emphasis. We had a lot of emphasis on thinking creatively about what it would mean to develop new wineskins for new wine. And so there's a long story of why I didn't find an institutional home to kind of accept a calling to full-time ministry. I think part of that was just getting into Christian education and seeing that as my ministry. Coming from Reformed roots, there's a big emphasis on education, and that's a valid calling. Just like being a mechanic, anything's a valid calling. And if you have a sufficiently rich theology and worldview of God, God has many expressions, many callings. And so I think part of it was that. Another part of it was just deep in my story. I watched kind of Presbyterian politics and culture wars play out. And they tended to go along lines of, do we ordain women as elders? I watched the church split off when I was young on that issue. Some of my armchair theologian dad's heroes were like R.C. Sproul, John Gerstner. John Gerstner was a theologian in residence at our church growing up. And so I sort of steeped in that traditional Reformed theology. In the Charles Hodge, B.B. Warfield were kind of the heroes on the bookshelf type thing. And so I was formed in that context, but I also watched the mainline and the sideline politics play out in the Presbyterian context. And I never quite felt like I could be at home in either world, if that makes sense. And I think being part of a parachurch didn't help that, because I'd have enough almost satisfying and inspiring experiences of ministry completely outside of either world that I didn't feel necessarily at home in either world. So there's a whole long story behind that.
Very liminal.
Yeah, it was very much, and then you're figuring out marriage and figuring out how to do career and how to start a family. So all of that played into practical questions.
Yep.
Then you asked about the switch to the Baptist denomination, and that was really more circumstantial than it was theological. Although I did, in order to do this in good conscience, I did do a deep dive into kind of Barth's theology of baptism, some of the early fathers, and I ended up, being infant baptized. I ended up making a decision to be credo baptized, very deliberately, not because I felt like there was something wrong with infant baptism. I actually refused to answer the question because it didn't make sense to me to see that as a black and white either or. For me, what happened was a couple of my boys wanted to get baptized, And we'd sort of been disrupted from our prior church experience through COVID and found ourselves in this awesome Baptist church. And it's like great relationships. And then in the process of a couple of my boys wanting to get baptized, we'd had this difficult conversation at home. And I'm like, well, they've already been baptized, because we were Presbyterian. And my wife is like, are you going to tell them that they can't be baptized? Like, does that make sense? And I'm just like, oh, no, that doesn't make sense to tell them that they can't do that in response to Jesus right now. Like, for some reason that just didn't, you probably criticize my lack of a very sophisticated understanding of or paedo baptism, but
Dude, you're talking to the wrong guy about that. I married Lutheran, and my wife got baptized so that we could be Baptist, and ended up not being Baptist. Listen, dude.
So
I could tell you about two of my kids' recent baptisms and how I feel like we framed that. So I mean, that is kind of the meta nature even of what we're talking about. It's like holding things, and it's like, yeah, it's a lot more blurry.
Well, so I get in I'm like talking with our pastor, and he's like, well, are you going to get in the water and baptize him? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I could never, in the Presbyterian polity, and there's lots of good reasons why in Presbyterian polity, not just anybody can come and administer baptismal waters. I totally get that. For some reason, and I can't really justify it, but I found myself A, wanting to baptize my boys and to get in there with it, and then B, sort of starting to feel the tugs in my heart, like, wait a second, I never went through the confirmation class that is supposed to happen as a complement to the baptism when you grow up in a Presbyterian church. You're supposed to go through confirmation. And that's kind of the Presbyterian way of bringing in the believer component. It just comes in a different time sequence. For whatever reason, my brother did it. I missed that for some reason. And so I had this feeling like, this isn't about which theology is right and which systematic. I have, it's all on my bookshelves, as you can see behind me. I can go find the chapters, to justify this or that. It's not academic. I'd already done too much of that. For me, it really came down to a loving response to Jesus at that moment. Felt like, for me, I needed to do this with my boys. I can't explain it and justify it at any higher level. I actually deliberately chose not to, because that was the only way I could go forward, was for me to just table that whole thing. Because otherwise I felt like, what, am I rejecting my roots? Like, I grew up in the most amazing Christian family in church. We were far from perfect, but I couldn't say that was wrong. It needed for me to be more at the level of just a personal response. So anyway, that's a long answer to two really great questions, but that's kind of how I would answer those two questions. It's messy, and I like how you brought like the meta quality of this, and why we're even talking about this. We don't even know each other, and yet there's these resonances, and I think it's super interesting how everybody in this little corner is kind of, we're groping around looking for answers and looking for ways to be authentically Christian, or not. But we are looking for, I think everybody is in good faith looking to have honest conversations about this. And it's just, I don't know, I find it refreshing to participate in it.
Well, I mean, I have a few thoughts. Let's see if I can hold on to them. But, mentioning the meta thing, the conversations with Brendan Graham Dempsey, I don't know if you followed along with several of those. I had one. Well, I mean, you hit on, what was happening in academia. I will give an opinion about Brendan. I'm just going to,
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that because I think that's a really good topic to lean into.
I will give you, and then I actually want to hit on baptism. So hopefully we can circle back around because there's resonance there, deep resonance, because two of my kids were just baptized, and from our family history and where we're going and where we're headed, this is complicated.
Yeah.
So Brennan Graham Dempsey, my opinion, because he came into the TLC to this little corner with a mission to bring the historical criticism of Scripture out, not because he thinks it's the only way to function or that it as a religion or in your faith, but that my opinion is that it happened to him. He has a brilliant mind.
Sure.
He's an author. He's creative. He has all this, but that happened to him at a very young age. In his story, he got exposed. His youth pastor exposed him to historical criticism when he was 13 or 14 years old.
Right.
When he was so sincere, and that's. Well, I'm just going to say it. It's damaging because he's still developing, and we are black and white. That part of our thinking is still not done, and hitting that that's why I say, well, I was in college, I'm at getting my biblical studies degree, and we touched on it and we went over it, and my professors didn't hide this from me, and I don't remember it feeling like a crisis.
Right.
And so, and obviously, Princeton, you were just enveloped in it, and then I even saw the beauty in it, and even like as a modern perspective. And so, I think it is important. Like I love the way that you brought it in and described that. And if he happens to watch this, I may try to point him to it on Twitter or something. But we all have our traumas that we are going to want to help people with. And I look at him coming in as a help to this space because there are all these online converts that got a psychological Christianity that maybe, and even a scientific Christianity, but maybe not a historical Christianity that could disrupt something in them in the future. If they run into it, even,
yeah, that's a really good point.
And so anyways, I appreciated you bringing that in. And then just the meta fact, I'll come on to this. Is this postmodern baptism, or is this something beyond that?
Oh, good. That's good. It could sound that way, couldn't it?
So I'll just bounce back our story.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, I shared this with Lance Cleaver yesterday. So my wife's family, her mom, historically Catholic, lots of Catholic bishop, archbishop, nuns in her family. Her grandma was the secretary at the Catholic school for, 50 years. Like, just, she walks away from my mother-in-law walks away from that, aiming for what she would believe is like a more personal relationship with God, but still like in the high church milieu. And they land Lutheran but my wife was actually baptized Catholic when she was born. And so then, I start dating her, and I'm pretty serious about trying to understand theology, even in high school when we met. And, so I'm meeting her parents. Her dad's a smart guy. He's a doctor. He's always, he's writing op-eds, having op-ed conversations in our little community newspaper with atheists when in the 90s, or late 90s and stuff.
Yeah.
Cared about such things deeply. And I was like, okay, so what is this? Lutheran, Catholicism? Okay, I think there's something with baptism here. I'm like very naive, but still kind of made sense. And so I began having that conversation. We get married 5 years later. And I had felt like I was supposed to do ministry, had kind of this experience, was trying to be obedient to that. And so I was explaining our wedding the other day, just yesterday. So, like we're at First Baptist Church in our town,
Yeah.
and in the South, and in walks two nuns in their habits and a archbishop in the Catholic Church to sit down, and sticking out like a sore thumb. And one of the things we decided to do was take communion together, and it was administered by our pastor at the church, but we were on a Catholic kneeler that was my wife's grandma's.
Wow.
I don't even, as I was just like, oh yeah, that's cool. I don't care. Like, as I'm looking back, I'm just like we were Baptists don't kneel to take communion, but we did. Like, so then, and she had gotten baptized a few weeks before that. And it was a conscious, her baptism was not because she felt like this was the right kind of baptism. It was because this is what it means to join with Christian and for us to do life together.
Yeah.
So, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So then, we're non-denominational till now, even now. And it's like, but the church we ended up working at had a clause for alien immersion so that we accepted it. So that's actually a huge deal. You don't think that's like, but it would, but we practiced credo baptism, but we accepted all Trinitarian baptism. So, but as not having our kids baptized, my wife having kind of a longing for that, me continuing to kind of grow towards a belief this is where I landed. I'm raising a Christian family.
Yeah.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Now, and that's kind of the idea in a covenantal family, I think. And you go higher to that, even though it's more totally sacramental, it's still just about being a Christian family, like in the hierarchy of the body of Christ. You have your, Christian family. And there's no question in my mind, historically, in a super patriarchal culture, that was just how that was going to play out then. So besides all that, what do you do in 2000 now? And and so we had kind of you mentioned kind of a strange thing happened at our church or your church. At some point there was something and that happened for us, and we find ourselves outside that. And our dearly beloved youth pastor there, he was in seminary. I had discipled him when I was his youth pastor. He was trying to get out of that church too. And before he left, me and my wife were like, we want him to baptize our children. And my oldest daughter, no question, she's been a Christian for a very long time. If there is a age, regardless, she's been spiritually minded. And then for our 10-year-old, she was coming into she actually was the one asking about baptism more, because she has much more of like I want to be a part of this. Like that's what it means to be a part of this. That's what I want to do, is be a part of this. My older one had more anxiety about trying to do that in front of a church, So, I ended up helping Baptist. We went out to a creek and had a bunch of our family and friends and my daughter's youth pastor and kind of, it was kind of like we are having our children baptized, but my children also wanted to be baptized.
Yeah.
And that kind of, to me, is the spirit. Now, I wasn't going to put my Credo Baptist youth pastor in the position to baptize my youngest without to maybe violate his conscience. So, that hadn't happened then. But yeah, that's what I offer you to the process of that.
So, and this happened how long ago?
Last summer.
Yeah. So what's interesting about it for me, and you were raised Baptist, is that right?
Mainly charismatic, then Baptist. But yeah, I was educated Baptist. All the spiritual, like most of the spiritual things in my life happened as I was a Baptist. I actually got baptized twice. My dad, when I was 4. So That's blurring the lines there. But apparently, I told my dad, I wanted to be a Christian or something, and he took it to heart. So
Yeah.
that was when we were charismatic. So, uh, and then when I was 15, it was a more so for some assurance in my mind was related to that.
So, I mean, I have an MDiv, at a not slouch institution. It's not like I can't go find, and then I grew up, absolutely dyed in the wool Presbyterian. I can find the chapters in the systematic theologies that parse this out. And they're my heroes as far as intellectual theological formation. So if I play that game, though, I feel like it's missing something that you hit on and that absolutely resonate. And it's almost like a total gestalt flip or a worldview. It's at that worldview and participatory, embodied, and storied level of meaning that
yes,
that was surprising because I had it all figured out. I had my volumes of theology for why I felt justified in just maintaining my infant baptism.
yep.
So I never thought that I would get believer baptized. I can't explain it other than at the level of relationship to Christ, his people. And it wasn't like it was without massive challenges and massive questions and deep, ponderous journal entries and things. And so something about what you said that resonates with me is that I've sort of been, I don't know. I don't want to nerdify this, but you know how Wittgenstein talks about language games and different grammars of meaning?
I know who Wittgenstein is.
He's the philosopher, 20th century philosopher.
That's it.
That's it. Okay. He's got so he's got this really interesting, I think it's a helpful concept. Like when you're playing chess, that's a game. Rules of the pieces. Playing football, that's a totally different game. Rules of moving the ball and tackling and unnecessary roughness. If you start thinking about all the games there are, and you realize how differently we use even the word game and rule, like you get overwhelmed with the variety of uses that there are. And that's just in games. That's an analogy for what we do with language. And I'm like, I see a parallel there. Like there's the systematic modern theological game of trying to parse it all out and be right so that you can publish a definitive theological tome on something and be in the position of being the right view. And I think that's important, and we need that. Like it's confessional and creedal conversations need to happen, and they need to be done with the best tools at our availability. But there's this whole other thing about participating in the life of the living, concrete, actual body that's right in front of you. And sometimes where those things don't always line up exactly in sequence. And I had the sense that there was something out of sequence in my experience of being baptized very, very young, coming to faith, being nurtured in faith, even being on campus ministry staff, right? And doing a church internship, doing an MDiv. But there was this, in the context of finding myself with my kids, having to make this choice, do I not get baptized with them? It sort of forced the issue on me in a way that totally surprised me. And I never dreamed I would have felt led to just tabling the whole, which tome of theology is right on this question, who's got the right take on church history, just out of a love response to Christ, out of that personal level. It was like a complete worldview flip. And that's why I bring up kind of the language game. It's like, it's a whole different game, man. You're not even understanding it if you're playing golf.
If you're playing systematic theology, you're going to miss this.
Yeah. And I say that I love theology. I think it's important, but man, can you get the cart in front of the ox on that?
It's two thoughts on that. For one, when Peterson says, I think that Western civilization is held together through a metaphysical and metaphorical substrate. a narrative substrate.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
I mean, so you went boop, you just hit that, and then secondly, well, so with my pastor who had this great influence on me, you know, in he was formed in a similar context that you were theologically.
Yeah.
Came out more conservative than that context, but still amazing. But that is, well, I don't know how to. I'm just saying that's creating. It creates a type of confidence. I don't know. It created a kind of confidence in me that you can go into these spaces.
Yeah.
And, when you're scared of the other, you have this theological xenophobia or something. You're like, oh no, what's this going to do to me? And it's like, well, I'm talking to Bryce. This is really cool. Or I'm talking, and it didn't just spin out something political is kind of, I think, what I'm pointing at. And necessarily. And so, at least at that time. And that was really powerful to me. But just that so I had this really wild conversation with this guy named Roy Clauser, who's he's a Christian philosopher, and a guy in this corner, C.W. Weeks, kind of orchestrated this happening. But to the best of what I think I can understand from his work, is the reality of God is more true in our experience.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what he's pointing at. And that's not how we've been framed in the modern context.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, and we're having to make the painful meta of going through or going beyond that right now. And baptism honestly is it really is a huge point on that. And the young man, Redeemed Zoomer, he took YouTube by storm the last 2 years ago. He's recently on Paul. And as he's doing kind of the systematic thing and condensing it, it's actually doing something past the modern thing by just like giving you the whole thing in 10 minutes is systematically and theologically, it's not more than that in what the content is, but that you can see almost the whole thing in 10 minutes is actually extremely powerful. And what it does is he did this like graph, and there was this huge red line under Presbyterianism with everything else above it. And it's basically sacraments, but even more than that, it's baptism, because when we get to credo and pedo baptism, and just seeing that was like, okay, well that's actually helpful. Just knowing, okay, we can kind of just say that's a thing right there. That's a real, and it has been for a long time. And there's legitimacy to why that's a thing. And I guess, and the other piece is just, you mentioned your son's age, your older kids, and we're kind of parallel there a little bit. And it got me thinking about, and you mentioned your skipping out on catechism or confirmation, that a friend of mine, and so even conversations that I've had like with Graham Grizz about rites of passage.
Yeah.
That baptism in your kids' lives is also operating as a type of rite of passage. Like that's not even, I mean, it's in the Old Testament. I mean, it's in, the Jewish practice of bar mitzvah, catechism, and confirmation, we're pointing at this like very large scale history. And there are parts that I would argue within, the credo culture and milieu that's not built in.
It's not. And it's funny. I had to go to seminary and be a campus minister before I recognized the fact. I mean, I knew that Jesus got baptized, but Jesus got baptized before he started his public ministry. I've heard the argument for when he got out of the waters, that meant that, it was poured. I've heard the argument, but it sure looks like he got immersed by John the Baptist, and then the Holy Spirit descended on him. And, I think it was, I'm not trying to make a case for which is the right take. It's just that there's a lot of talk on this channel about going to Orthodoxy, some going to Rome, and that's been frankly in the air for a long time. Like coming from Wichita, St. George's I think is the cathedral congregation for the entire Antiochian in America denomination. Like I've been to Eighth Day Books. I've heard the arguments. I even wanted to possibly go down that path in the late 90s, early 2000s. This is not a new topic for me. Like having longing eyes towards the East and the whole evangelicals on the road to Canterbury and Rome Sweet Home. Like, my brother's Catholic. He became Catholic. So I get it.
That's great.
I've read Etienne Gilson. I love Etienne Gilson. Marshall McLuhan's one of my heroes. I could very easily almost justify that whole move. I think what I'm trying to say by painting that picture is, like, people have their valid reasons for why they're going on this journey. It's also valid to try to figure out how to be a good, faithful Protestant in the modern world, especially since so much of the modern world is owing to us Protestants. I think we also have a place at the table in the conversation to try to figure this out. You know what I mean? It's
yeah.
I fully respect. And like Paul says, I celebrate the renewal and the return and even the changing of confessional families. It's just that it's also valid to remain in your Protestant skins, or even find a new Protestant skin and try to grow there with other people, right?
Well, because that may be all you have.
Exactly.
We do have a Catholic church in our town, but I think to that point, that is the interesting thing. I said this on I did a little late night show with my friend Pete from Strange Theology. We've done it twice on Saturday nights, but it's like, I said, Redeemed Zoomer may be a little too based for my taste, but but he's pointing at something. He sees something, and he thinks that the main line is basically the state church of the United States, the unofficial culture and institution.
Yeah.
And he's pointing to, and whether or not his diagnosis and his prescription is the right on how that works out, that going east or going to Rome is kind of bypassing the institution that exists already here, that we have to, in the Peterson term, get our house in order.
That's a really interesting point.
And so he's trying, and I think you're amazing. But in some ways you're young and naive, and that's actually good, because that means you're going to just you're not going to give a shit. But it's but the thing to that is, he inspires me to want to be part of something. Now, how militant he is about that may be another question on some of his stuff. But what you're saying is the seat at the table. Man, there's other. So, oh man, I have one more thing.
Yeah, go for it.
Overwhelming me. So back in when I first started putting out these YouTubes, I said something along the lines of, is ARC, which was Peterson's big thing back in the fall last year, is his ARC big enough to sail the West through the meaning crisis?
Great question.
And the ARC, and then I pointed to Asbury College Revival and this big thing that happened at Passion this year, and Passion Worship Conference, and then I was also pointed at Redeemed Zoomer. I didn't really do anything with the East and the West on Catholicism and Orthodoxy, but that when you say seat at the table, and when I think of that, man, it just made me think of, It made me think of that the king of Rohan in the Lord of the Rings
Mm,
that is possessed by Saruman, and he has to get exorcised by Gandalf.
yeah,
So
Theoden.
because the heart of man's city is actually uh the great white what is that the and but they're not like the primary kingdom of man, but they're like this, I don't know, and they're this piece that actually is needed to come in and at a time, and that's just kind of the image that came to my mind when you said that about um
In
the
that analogy, is Theoden representing
Protestantism.
Protestantism? Oh, I love that. Yeah,
Because,
yeah.
the great God,
Grim-
what's that with a
So
G? What's the saying?
Grima worm tongue would be, in that analogy, would be something like
I don't wanna
godless modern. What would it? Would any variety of ism?
yeah.
Interesting.
It
Yeah.
and a spirit, yeah, that needs a revival, and I'm not just
Mhm.
talking like Asbury revival, but, a type of revival,
Yeah.
and Redeemed Zoomer he's pointing at that, and
Yes.
like I said, I don't know if it's all some of it's too based for my taste, but at the same time, like,
Well, let me try this out.
yeah, go for it.
I wanna riff on that. I think that's really good. Look, man, you and I are evangelicals, right? At the end of the day, in that analogy, Gandalf coming up and giving deliverance is a real encounter with the living God in the person and in the work of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. The Holy Spirit is the third person of God entering in and actually transforming that man. And I want to say this, like, I think you would agree. The red line for me and what unites us with, I don't care which variety of orthodoxy you are. I don't care even if you are non-Chalcedonian. I don't care. Like, do you have in your church and in your theology and in your way of participating in sacrament, do you have this centerpiece, which interestingly was absolutely front and center of Jordan Peterson's message last week, which I want to touch on?
Yeah, I wanna
Is the
get
center of reality for you the sacrifice of Christ on the cross of Golgotha? Is his life and his sacrifice the thing that defines, like, where it's at, to quote Beck, for you? Like, if that's where it's at for you, then I'm with you. And I don't care if you're Catholic. I don't care if you're Orthodox. I don't care if you're Baptist, if you're mainline or sideline Presbyterian. I've been all of that except for the Orthodox and the Catholic. But like I said, I have family in that. I'm with this. This is what I came out of seminary strongly convinced of. Have you heard of Thomas Oden?
mm-mm.
Agenda for Theology. I'm looking for it. It's this book. Tom Oden. He wrote this in 1979. The postmodern person has been through the best and the worst that modernity has to offer. The postmodern person is looking for something beyond modernity, some source of meaning and value that transcends the assumptions of modernity. Neck deep in the quicksands of modernity, the postmodern mind is now struggling to set itself free. Some of these postmoderns have happened on classical Christianity and experienced themselves as having been suddenly lifted out of these quicksands onto firmer ground. They have then sought to understand the incredible energy and the delivering power of Christianity, and in the process of returning to the classical texts of ancient Christian tradition and to Scripture, they have begun to discover that the orthodox core of classical Christianity constitutes a powerful, wide-ranging, viable critique of modern consciousness. 1979.
Yep. We're way downstream.
This is not the first time this topic's come up. It's just that back then they didn't have the internet. We're participating in a resourcement and in a ecumenical resourcement that is not mushy, whateverism, relativism, pluralism, ecumenism. It's more robust. It's robust. It's creedal. It's confessional, but it's dexterous enough. It's flexible enough that I'm not going to go freak out if somebody doesn't line up with my tribe.
Yep. Well, and the interesting thing about that book coming out in 79, say 50,000 people read that book.
Right.
How do they find each other?
Right.
They couldn't. I mean, maybe there were some message boards in the 90s of the hardcore, like, oh, look, you read that book too. This makes it, oh, not only are you still in the 90s stuck to the literal,
Yeah.
but now you could get online and find somebody and have that conversation, and then you can share the conversation. I mean, we're entering into a space that's I can't even articulate how unreal the fact that I'm literally a dude in a rural town in Arkansas, like just a dude, like had a messed up life, and Jordan Peterson played a big role, and so like we can kind of go into that point, which he just was on with Russell Brand and yesterday, and you went and saw him last week, and I saw him back in February, and he's hitting on sacrifice on this We Who Wrestle with God. I don't know how he's going to tie that. I mean, he talks about, but I don't know what the book is going to, I mean, and now he's doing a series on the Gospels coming up on Daily Wire with Peugeot. And so with my story, Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham's story in general is a huge archetype for me.
Yes.
And then as a Christian, then I just like automatically made the move, like, well, okay, to the gospel, to Jesus on the cross. But the move actually wasn't to the gospel story. The move was to Jesus saying that he's the way, the truth, and the life.
Mm.
And that was what came to me. And so those are like the binding things for my faith, that like these, and that you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Like those are like the binding things.
Yeah.
But the sacrifice is something, and you were saying like, in a Christian confession, can we come together around the sacrifice of Christ? And that the language, that I had a beautiful conversation with Hezi, who's an Orthodox Jew, part of this Noahide movement, being able to have resonance with this serious, and even with what Jordan Peterson's doing by starting in Genesis, this seriousness around Abraham, speaks deeply to a Jewish friend.
Yes.
And so there's a lot at play there. So I'll toss it back on your experience recently with him, and even at large, your experience with Jordan Peterson, because this is a lot downstream from that.
Yeah, good. What I picked up on, this is the first time I'd seen him. He just flat out came out and said, it starts with Cain and Abel, and Abel is a dim picture of what it can cost to aim and live rightly. It can cost your life. And so you have two basic, in hyper contrasting terms, you have two basic archetypal orientations, Cain and Abel. Abel's thread gets picked up by Abraham, and especially the story of Abraham and Isaac. And then that gets picked up essentially in the experience of Israel, Assyria, Babylon. The entire Old Testament is a picture of Israel living sacrificially, paying for its covenant identity. And it centers in Jesus, the center of the New Testament, who ultimately goes through the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice. How much of that am I reading into with Christian theological lenses? I don't know. I heard him essentially say that the center theme of the Bible is Christ on the cross, sacrificially living and dying and paying the ultimate price. And that unites this entire strand. And I thought that is getting very, very, very close to affirming something like the first part of the Apostles' Creed.
Yep.
The died, buried, and rose again part, is still open to question whether or not he said some interesting things about that. But I've always so Jordan Peterson in particular, like in general, for me, why have I been so interested? I have heard him from the very beginning as somebody who is content to swim in his lane. He's a Jungian psychologist. He's a clinical psychologist. He's going at the Bible from those lenses because he's staying in his lane. And I've heard him say, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm not saying that it did, because I'm not speaking as a theologian. I'm speaking as a person. But what I am going to tell you is that if you orient your life towards Christ and the Logos, towards what it is, new birth, rebirth within, you will have a better life. Well, that just starts to sound a heck of a lot like the way we talked as campus ministers in the evangelical Christian movement. It starts to, you want to parse it out and find, well, where's the true born again experience? I totally get that. And I think that that's real. I think we do need to be born again. But John 3:16, that whole John passage, it's not so clear that it's a point in time that you say the magical words. It's also born again from above. It's that there's a gracious quality, whether that takes a long time or happens overnight, I don't know. The important thing is that it happens from above, that it's a gracious reaching down from God's Spirit. And so I just found, like, in Jordan Peterson's, number one, he's taking the Bibles very seriously. People are getting helped. People are finding their ways into church. And I'm looking at this going, this is absolutely something we need to be talking about and thinking about theologically. I saw tons of parallels with him in the theology of Reinhold Niebuhr. Mm-hmm. Sort of the whole orientation towards theology that kind of takes its cues from Kierkegaard and, that late 19th century kind of post-Kant conversation in theology it gets really heady and academic. But the bottom line is Kierkegaard kind of comes in and says, look, it's about a personal relationship. It's about faith and living out of faith. And all these official labels and the Danish state church and institutional Christendom can really be a distraction from what's really at stake here. And so I see it. I think Paul's commented on this before, and others in the channel. There's a lot of Protestant. If you're familiar with middle to late 19th century Protestant theology, there's a lot of that in Jordan Peterson's orientation towards the scriptures and towards faith.
Well, it'd have to be, because this is our world, and
that's what formed him, right? He's from Canada, and I think he has Church of Canada roots. That essentially that was their operating theology. He may not know the name Reinhold Niebuhr, but it's like, dude, that is exactly who they were reading, and that's exactly the orientation. And it's I think this is the piece, and this is the question of is it Brendan Graham
Dempsey?
I think the question for both Jordan Peterson and for Brendan is, after all of that, after Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Freud, all the moderns, I think the question is who is Jesus? Jesus, who do you say that I am? Like, at the end of the day, who is Jesus? But I see Peterson's project. I see him absolutely content to be a gateway for people to have that personal encounter. He's not opposed to that at all. He also doesn't see himself as like tasked as I am vocationally, to try to actively and as an ambassador actually actively seek that to happen. So that's the difference, but I'm okay with that difference. We all have different callings, and what does Jesus say? He who's not against us is for us. If he's helping people find the church, if he's helping these conversations to happen, I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful that his wife joined the church, and he's going to benefit from that.
I think he believes he will. I think he said he already has.
Yeah.
He said that she became more of who she is as a person, and my love for her is who she is as a person.
Yeah.
And so he is more of herself than my love for her. Like, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And he's his own nexus of, he carries something. He's carrying something right now.
Yeah.
He's not unconscious of it, but you don't want to be too conscious of it. But how can you not be at that level? With Vervaeke's Silk Road and this whole idea, like, I don't know how much he thinks. If I walk through that door, the door culturally in some ways closes behind me.
Right.
I don't know if that's on his, I don't know how deeply that is. And one of his dearest and most trusted friends is Jonathan Pajot, who is a testifying Christian.
Yeah.
That he maybe trusts more than anyone, or saw something. I mean, their relationship's very fascinating. You even mentioned his, when you were going through John 3 and you were talking about God being saved from above, that took me automatically to Pajot, like the symbolic, like coming down, and as I'll reference my conversation with Hezi again, an Orthodox Jew, Noahide Jew, just that these men are creating a language.
Yeah.
And it's happening online. And John is Vervaeke, they're creating a language to cognitively create bridges and unifications along lines that confessionality wasn't. Well, it explicitly was to wall off for lots of different reasons that are. I don't have enough history background to know all of them, but just some basic ones. Some of them have to do with power, other of them have to do with faith. But that, okay, when those walls are down now, what do we do? How do we talk to one another? And man, just the fact that you're at a First Baptist, man, and having this conversation is just so alive to me. That it's great to have that, because I don't know of any Baptists that are playing openly, and the fact that you're a pastor actually, playing openly online. I think there's probably maybe something to the fact that you're in Austin, that you keep things weird, that maybe is some allowance for that. There's, but that's interesting to me.
Why is it that our identities in ministry sometimes can, well, what's the phrase? That which binds us can blind us.
Yeah.
And sometimes denominational and vocational ministry lenses don't allow you to have a certain type of conversation, and don't allow you to present yourself as open to certain things. So I think of this as, this is a great opportunity. John MacArthur recently, my Twitter is blowing up with comments.
I saw it this morning.
John MacArthur saying there is no PTSD, there's no OCD, there's no, what's the
ADHD?
No ADHD.
Yeah.
And I just, some of the comments on that are just awesome. It's like, but I mean, what is it? Why do you feel competent or B, moved to make such a pronouncement about something that you have not actually studied, you don't actually know, and could be harmful to people? Like, yes, I agree that we can psychologize the faith away. That's a particular evangelical liability, right? Just like maybe the liberal Protestant liabilities towards social movement reduction. But Anyway,
Well, I think
I don't want to go off on John MacArthur.
no, yeah.
I want to actually pick up
Okay,
and
go ahead. Yeah,
I
go
wanted
for
to
it.
resonate with you a bit on that, because I have felt in lurking and in listening and in watching in TLC that there might be a bit of an opportunity to talk more about how the various strands of Protestantism also have a legitimate place at the table and a legitimate motive to try to participate in this conversation from within Protestantism. It's not always the case that just church shopping or ancient church shopping is the only way to authentically have a conversation about Christianity today. Like, that is a valid way, but it's not the only way. So I think it would be good to have more, but particularly for this reason, and I'd love to get your thoughts. Like, given that so much of modernity is a product of Protestant culture, and was it Redeemed Zoomer that the state church of America is mainline Protestantism?
Yeah.
That means a lot of our modernity is fueled by a Protestant way of being Christian. I mean, look at higher education. George Marsden's book on higher education was sort of presided over by Protestant ministers until the middle 19th century, late 19th century.
Well, and the what it makes me think of is, well, was the American Revolution was against England state church,
Yep.
Protestant. But that's our relationship.
Yeah.
And regardless of if we had a war for independence, you can't change the fact that we were basically an English colony, that. And so
Yep.
there's that piece of it too, which is why maybe to some degree, as I'm saying this, I remember being a kid and I had this weird, it was some kind of like all the presidents on this little thing and it had some little slide on it, and it was going down and it basically was saying every president and what church they were affiliated with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember, I don't know where it came from. And I remember being like, Episcopal. What is Episcopal? I'm probably 10 or 13 or something. I don't know. But to that point, I mean, and I think that it's also though a mixture because if you then you zoom out to the West, the other big piece obviously is Catholicism, and it makes me think of science, their scientific enterprise. That those two things together actually are why we are what we are.
Yes.
More and that what's happening now with Orthodoxy is a rejection of the modern impulse. And okay, there's this thing, and I think so much of it's subconscious, but that it's like we find ourselves in the meaning crisis, and it's like, well, who wasn't a part of this whole damn project? Oh, it's those guys. Okay, let's go hang out with them. And
Right.
so, and that's good. That's actually good in the sense that we're like, well, God, what do we do? What do we do? Because if they're new converts, then they don't have the context or the theological training maybe to recognize the Protestant thing. Right. And so, but if we have been in that context, for your whole life, like I'm a product of American evangelicalism. I can't even express to you how evangelical I was born into. Steve Green and Petra and like Michael W. Smith, like this whole musical ethos, but also evangelical. People talk about this ideal, and I haven't talked a whole lot about my personal childhood. I've came into this conversation with kind of my high church connection with my what I married into, and what in some ways I've been looking at to help round out this oblongness of my evangelical Protestantism, like trying to create more of a spherical shape to my faith, because that's a part of the history. So it's like, but I grew up in this house, and it's like we had the ABC Bible verses around our kitchen table. Shout out to my mom, and we would learn all these scriptures, and we did felt stuff like people do at Sunday school. We were doing it at home. My mom bought a whole felt thing for us to just learn about Bible stories. And when people idealize the Orthodox way of living,
Yeah.
like, oh, a Christian life, like I got a certain brand of that in my home that was like a Christian home, like not in a very, my parents were something you could call radical and sold out, because of situation, because of my dad's conversion experience. And it wasn't cultural only, but it was like this American religious right culture thing that I haven't tapped into in this space much. But as I'm hearing you, it's interesting to have this conversation about, reference Redeemed Zoomer. You went to a hugely institutional Protestant academic training. And I had been having conversations with, C.W. Weeks, he's Presbyterian too. And he's had issues within the OPC, and now he attends a PCUSA, and there's all sorts of things in there. But it's in the conversation. My first conversation I had with Lance Cleaver was doing things from within versus talking about things from within versus, and you hit on this, things, commenting on things from without.
Yeah.
And I think that, there's something there about that. I have a desire to be a part of reviving. Like, I can't do that. I can't do that or be a part of that if I go into one of these historical wings that I actually don't have context for. Now, some people might need that. There's a lot of different reasons why people need that.
Yeah.
But we have to kind of like find and be thoughtful maybe about what is our makeup? What is our history? So I don't know. I'm just ripping, man.
What you're doing by fostering conversations, I see what you're doing is very similar to what Paul's doing, and that Paul Vanderklay is you're fostering a third space that is friendly and open to people of different confessional and creedal lineage or orientation, belonging, and maybe a question is like, why are you doing it? And to go back to the theoden, because that's such a good, like a concrete image, the theoden being delivered by Gandalf. If Gandalf is Christ, the Holy Spirit, kind of co-working to humanize us and deliver us from the dehumanizing spirit of modernity, we need to have good conversation as sort of a playing field. Like that's almost like the place where we meet to play. And by fostering that, it'd be great. Like if you wanted to just go get on the Orthodox bandwagon, and I don't say that disrespectfully. I mean that like that would be good. They would benefit. They would have one more person who's sincere, and that would be good for them. It would be good for you. But the opportunity cost might be that your time and energy for doing this might be otherwise diverted, and we need more people who are able to wade into the mess here and process, because I think what we're talking about is how do we be authentic Christians together in a most modern context? Like is it postmodern? Maybe. I think it's very modern in some ways. Like it's most modern. And if it is, like what role did Christianity have in giving rise to modernity? Because we might want to wrestle with that some. And then I think it's relevant to which confession you line up with too, because it's fine to go to Rome Sweet Home, and it's fine to go to Orthodoxy. But if you find yourself Protestant, it isn't like we don't have a couple of 100 years of trying to work that out here. And we need all the help we can get.
Yep. Is the ark big enough?
Yeah. Yeah.
And somebody like Peterson, the thing that I have been able to tease out is I mentioned this in my conversation with Paul, but is a type of psychological Christianity.
Yeah.
Or psychological theism, to zoom out more. But and I loved your take on that. It is an added. Well, there's reasons because I do believe that the more and the most historical churches actually did aspects of psychological Christianity.
For sure.
Things like confession, those sacraments, and that they were divorced. And it's interesting because I think even Jung and Freud wanted that divorce to happen. They wanted a secular confessor relationship. I've learned that in this space actually. And that, but there were true reasons for the Reformation. There were real reasons, and what I've had to wrestle with and recognize is when things like sola scriptura and sola fide were still so wrapped in a sacramental life, like
that's right.
That
and in a spiritual formation, centuries of spiritual formation, spiritual theology.
That wasn't what was happening. Was a total rejection.
No,
but when we take the solas into somebody, which I did, I had a great appreciation after Paul talked to Gavin Ortland about his Presbyterian background, which I knew his dad was. I think it's Ray or what's his dad?
I think it is Ray.
Yeah. So like, that he's not devoid of that even in his own formation. But, and now that you are Baptist, you operating in sola fide and sola scriptura is actually very different than people that are only raised operating in that. And it's that is a tension that I think that I poke on in this space some because, having been lived that and knowing what that is, apart from a sacramental, an intentionally and an explicit sacramental life, because obviously there's implicit and unintentional sacramental things that happened in the lower church. They aren't called that. So so that when I hear when Peterson's thing happened in my brain with all of that, I realized, okay, as a modern worship leader, what is psychologically happening in the church right now when I'm doing my modern worship leader thing? Oh, well, it's pretty sacramental, but because it's embodied, it is actually an embodied, and this is actually a dispensation of grace because this is what people are coming here to receive. And but we can't call it that. And it's a little more ephemeral. It's a little more ephemeral than actually saying that if I'm touching the elements and drinking and chewing the elements, that is way less ephemeral. That is actually very embodied and participate. And so it's like, and hugely informative and impact on me was my dear friend who came into that church having been actually kind of a modern Mennonite ministry, and then that all fell apart, and a marriage fell apart related to that, and he goes into a Catholic life and marriage that he said to me, my time in the Catholic Church, Christian, was like a candlelight dinner with Jesus. And then he comes into this, evangelical, little mishmash evangelical church thing that we're doing. And he's just having conversations with me. And he's like, we're talking about communion. And he said so many things to me. I love him so much. He said, Christian, maybe when you're like taking communion, and you're chewing on that wafer, that you realize that Christ's body is being broken for you. Like that's what's happening.
Yeah.
And he was like, and if we were drinking wine, that the bit, Welch's is pretty sweet, but like, but if you're drinking wine,
Yeah.
that's something like the bitterness
Yeah.
of that crucifixion. And I'm just like,
Mhm.
no one's ever talked to me about this. This is only a non-real symbol of the icon of what's taking place, not an actually embodiment of. I mean, he didn't know maybe exactly why he knew that this experience in the Catholic Church was transformative for him. But he brought it in. So he comes out of Protestantism, he goes into the historical church, and then he comes out of the historical church and brings the things from that into the Protestantism. I just had a wild experience with that. Also, people felt like they could talk to me about it because of my wife's family too, behind closed doors. And it was just like, I was having this synthesis and this process that made me love everything even more.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's part of the makeup of this and this space. All that stuff's, around 10 years ago now, but it so informs these conversations. And in some ways, what I didn't realize is as I start hearing Jordan Hall talk about, I don't know if it's who he's referencing when he's talking about a beauty first. I don't know if that's Father Schmemann or
Alexander Schmemann.
I can't remember if it's him or not, but it's like that to me was a beauty.
Yeah.
All of those relationships and those conversations are coming from a very beautiful relational space of my faith. And I that is what I'm bringing here.
Yeah.
That is what I'm bringing here.
I think that's awesome, and it's deeply traditional. The Catholics are awesome on foregrounding aesthetic and embodied, right? Because of the sacramental worldview, and it makes me think of like von Balthasar in his "The Glory of the Lord" is the first instance of his theology is the beauty, the form manifest. And then it goes on to the ethics, the drama, theodrama, and then it ends with theology. Exactly the opposite order of Protestant systematics. And there's absolutely something very, very powerful about that. Oh gosh, you hit on a lot of stuff. So, question: where are you now in your church journey? Are you happily kind of in the non-denominational world? Are you seeking? Yeah.
So did you catch the rise and fall of Mars Hill, that whole thing?
I listened to people talk about it. I'd never listened to maybe more than one or two. Yeah.
Something like that kind of happened at my church that I had my own rise and fall in, but wasn't the part of it kind of collapsing wasn't me at this point. It survived.
Yeah.
It survived me.
Right. But you couldn't participate in it any longer.
Yeah. But I was there even after like I was fired, and over time we came back and participated there for another 6 years, and then something like that happened. And so there was a contingent of people. I got out, and then about 6 to 9 months later, things kind of then went. Like I was part of like tip of the spear of some of that going down.
Yeah.
And so then when it did, I got a text from a family that said, me and my wife did, from another couple, should we do something? Christmas is coming up. Advent's coming up. And I am equipped to do church. I'm equipped to provide a certain kind of church for people. Because I provided church for 10, 15 years, the Protestant evangelical way. And in the last 4 years of that, I brought in a liturgy. a light Presbyterian liturgy through this hire of the guy that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
We did that. We formalized it.
Yeah.
While at the same time still playing Hillsong and Passion and stuff. But confessions and creeds, confessions of sin, creeds, calls to worship, prayers of illumination, benediction, like reading of the word. We brought in, I don't know if it's light, but we brought in and we practiced it. We practiced it for several years. So that was, I was like, well, I can do this for these people, these 10 or 15 families that aren't going anywhere for Advent, that are brokenhearted. Me and my wife, we can do this. So that was the fall of last year. So we're still hanging with a group of people and doing that in a family's house. But I bring this little cross and I light a candle and it's in the center. We're not in the center, and the guy preaching is that guy that we were in church with for about 10 years. We're just taking some of his sermons, and I have asked him, I was like, hey, could you say a little, like 5 to 10 minutes about Holy Week for our church? And he's like, yeah, and he tells jokes about things that happened when he lived here, and we're like laughing along. It's an interesting thing that even is kind of connected to what we're doing right now with conversation, but that it's not like, yeah, we could have gone and we could dig up old Tim Keller sermons, or we could do like, there's a myriad, but that's not what we want. Somebody we know, somebody we trust, somebody that has loved us and we loved this person. It's like, and it's very strange. So, we're wrestling, and I think the conversation is coming soon about what do we actually do, because this has been just kind of a respite, and I'm not interested in another splinter. I either want to land somewhere. I want to submit myself to something else. That is bigger than me.
Yeah.
That does have history. I'm interested in that. There's several ways in which that could happen.
Yeah.
Because we've got like 30 to 50 people hanging out, and that have all been formed. None of them are people that we've tried to like. It's not an evangelistic endeavor.
Yeah.
These are all people that were at that community, that all these forms and all this thing is just familiar. It's Presbyterian. But it's Presbyterian in a, like I said, that context of alien immersion, but most of the people would come from a theologically Baptist background.
Yeah.
Not everybody. That's where I'm at right now, and
that's really cool. That's neat. Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. I got this image of, do you remember Zelda?
Oh yeah.
Legends of Zelda. Did you play that?
Oh yeah. Ocarina of
The
Time.
original?
Well, I was familiar with the original, but Ocarina of Time defined basically was like a Pinult video game for me.
Okay. So the original one that came out on the NES was, you had that little bank of supplies, and you go around and you kill things and you find these treasures, and you have to use there's the meat steak and the candle and the bombs. And I love that. Sorry, this is probably inappropriate, but like you describing like the way that you have found some of these elements of traditional liturgy and through the Presbyterians,
and the Lutherans.
Yeah. It's like, but I think the thing that's really cool about that is you're on this quest, you're on this adventure, and you're finding these things that you, in the context of, I need these, we need these in order to continue the journey, in order to keep fighting these beasts and go and, hopefully get to the destination. And I think there's something really deeply traditional about the theology of the way versus the settler kind of mentality where you've got all the architecture and you've got all the things and it's all ready made. And there's nothing wrong with participating in a more settled tradition, but I think there's something beautiful about going and trying to be faithful disciples and finding the resources to nourish you as you go and to be part of a resourcement. It reminds me that C.S. Lewis talks about we need to find a room eventually, but it's also okay to go through that hallway and to be in that process. So yeah, I wish you well on that. That is I know that feeling of liminality. We went through a period of that too, where we were kind of doing a home church, and I think I live with a certain amount of that, being an outsider to traditions,
but loving them at the same time.
But loving them and discovering them as that meat steak that you need in order to get through. I can't quite make sense of the idea that everybody needs to find the same confessional family in order for that to happen authentically.
Yeah.
I think Jordan Hall said something about this recently. Like it can't be that game. It's going to have to be something more emergent and more, but whatever it is, game on, like let's go figure it out together.
Yeah, it is. Game on. I love that. Thank you for that encouragement. I think the piece that for several people's conscience is that red line of sacramentalism.
Yeah.
That we are dancing around. So
I felt the biggest gap in sacramental theology was not between Orthodox and Catholic, or even Catholic and Reformed or Protestant. The biggest gap is between Zwingli and Calvin.
Yes.
The biggest gap is actually smack dab through the middle of Reformed Swiss theology, because it's either real presence, and I put all of the traditional Christianities in the magisterial Reformed on one side of that line, or it is merely a symbol. And too often Calvin gets painted with the wrong paintbrush, as if he's a Zwinglian. And it's like, real presence is real presence. It's spiritual real presence, but it's real presence.
And how you honor that.
Yeah.
And both of them actually are an honoring. That's the thing.
That's right.
And man, this conversation, I had no idea, Bryce. I had no idea what this conversation, but it has been so beautiful and intense and spiritual to me. So
for me too. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, man. We're getting close on time.
Yep.
And I don't know if there was any other thing that you wanted to kind of bring forward, but we got about 7 minutes we can do online. So
yeah,
I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to bring out.
Man, thanks for sharing. I love that we started this. I'll say this. I didn't know what we were going to talk about either, and I was a little nervous, but I love that we began this with a little prayer. And I don't know if you want to.
That's fine.
You don't make that public. Yeah. We prayed together, and just that little quiet thought of, this isn't about me or you. This isn't about like wanting to look cool. There's an element of that when you go on a camera that sort of distorts, and we're broadcasting a conversation. But I think what's cool is I totally sense this common ambition here of, you said it very well in the prayer, like, if there's something that might even just encourage one person, if a lot of the conversation can in this little corner can get a little bit who's right and like who's insightful and who's smart. And it's really easy for me to get into that game because I love books. But I think the deeper spirit and what's always been attractive to me is it's more the person matters more. Like people matter more than the problem. And we're trying to figure out this thing together. So something way bigger is happening. And if we can play the game so as to move the ball even a few yards forward in that, that's good. And, it's like, I think I've not participated in the online part for a long time because out of some fear that I'm going to make this about my ego and stuff. And I think there's a legitimate concern there, but I think there's also a time to just put that aside and just take the risk, jump in and start working it out together. Dojo. I think you called it like dojo. It's a dojo.
Mm-hmm. It is. And my encouragement and experience with that is to acknowledge it, jump in, and then when it comes up, continue to be honest about it.
Yeah.
About the ego, because to pretend, to come in here and pretend like that stuff's not at play is the wrong posture. Yeah, I think this little stuff's cool, and having the intro, like doing this fun tech stuff, cool, fun, interesting. And trying to make a camera work and all stuff. Light, I've got lights in here, I've got a light right up here. I've got, yeah, because I am trying to play in this space, but I also want to acknowledge like that it's like Grim Grizz, like we can break the fourth wall anytime we want to.
Right.
And by doing that is to acknowledge that there's things at play within us, and there's things at play around us that challenge our humility or challenge our authenticity, and trying to stay there that's a game too. And but may we play it honestly, I guess. So
well, that's why I wanted to talk to you. I see you doing that, and what you're trying to figure out with your church, your 50 strong so odd church is the embodied counterpart to this.
Yep, it is. And I'm having two guys over. One of them hangs out on Sunday. The other guy not, but is it's yeah, man. There's so much trying to follow the logos of it, the spirit of it, and this little connection here, or big connection that you and I have had today is it's beautiful, and fun and encouraging and interesting. It's all the things that are good about this. So I'm gonna shut this thing down and hang around, and we'll close this thing out backstage.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks, Christian.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Bryce. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.